sisters. You've got me once again, but fortunately just for this first half. We were talking about today about Hasan al-Basri and Rabia al-Adawiyyah, two truly great figures of Islam. And Sister Tamana Dakik will be covering Rabia in the second after the break. So I'll be talking about Hasan al-Basri. You know, Hasan al-Basri is such a figure that I would call him a stem cell figure. You know how in the body, when the fetus is growing up, the cells divide in the embryo or fetal stage. And before cells can be differentiated as certain like neurons or liver cells, they are exactly the same. But they can be just about any cell. They've got the DNA of everything within themselves, so they could be anything. So Hasan al-Basri is such a figure. He's a stem cell scholar in a sense. You see him as a theologian, as an ascetic, you know, spiritual man, hadith scholar, and many disciplines converge on him. Or from him, or from his time, it converges onto the rest of Islamic history. It's a bit like being close to the center of something, epicenter of an important startup for the beginning of Islam as we know it in 7th century. It's always tight in the center, and when you go out to the peripherals, you know, the angles sort of diverge, and in a sense that's when specialties come in. So Hasan al-Basri lived in that pivotal time of the generation after the companions. You know, the companions of the Prophet, may God reward them all, they experienced Islam in a way that none of us can. They watched the revelation of the Quran unfolding after a particular event. Or when the Prophet, peace be upon him, said something or did something, they knew exactly the context, not just what he said. So in a sense, they were the witnesses to the revelation of this religion. Whereas everyone else, we learn all of these things through other people, report or transmission. So there is that, it's same with the disciples of Jesus, for instance. The disciples experienced Jesus. They knew about him. They did not have to study Jesus to know what kind of a person he was. But later, Muslims and Christians, we learn Isa alayhi salam or Jesus from what other people have transmitted to us. So that's inevitable, unfortunately, but at the same time, it's absolutely crucial for a religion to be passed on intact in its full sense. These individuals become absolutely critical, these early figures, to the health and the safety in a way. You know, if religion is a amana, it's a trust to us, to humanity, in its pristine, revealed form, the amana has to be transmitted intact safely to future generations. But religion is not just, you know, it's not like money or shares or things that can be just kept in a box and moved on and passed from one person to one person. That's easy to preserve. It's easy to preserve, but once it's lost, you can never get it back. Whereas religion is meant to be preserved in the lives of the people at that particular point in time, and as they practice it. That makes it harder, but also makes it safer, because when one individual disappears, you've got plenty of others from which you can learn the religion. So in that sense, he lived in a pivotal time. He was born in 642 in Medina. His father was a prisoner of war, and in that sense he was a slave. And the person who purchased him was Zayd bin Thabit, who's everybody, if you're familiar with the Quran sciences, he was a chief scribe of the Prophet, peace be upon him. And he's the one later, when Quran was put into a book form, he was commissioned by the Caliph Abu Bakr to do that task. So a very important person in terms of transition of knowledge. And Zayd was himself a scholar and memorized the whole Quran by heart. And his mother was also a prisoner of war, in that sense, slave. And she was purchased by Salama. And who's that? The wife of the Prophet, peace be upon him. And then his father was freed by Zayd, and he married his mother, obviously. And because of the relationship of Salama, Hasan al-Basri is known to have been suckled by Salama when his mother was not around, as the reports say. So he was right in the household of the Prophet, peace be upon him. And even Salama would take him to meet other companions. And even at one stage, Omar prayed for him and asked that God would make him a knowledgeable person. And that's when he was 2 years old, still a baby. But so he grew up in Medina amongst the companions, and it is reported that he knew about 70 of them. 70 of the companions who attended the Battle of Badr. As you know, you may or you may not know, the companions are classified, or there's a hierarchy of who's more important. It's always who became first, the early Muslims, because that's when it was the hardest to believe in the Prophet, peace be upon him. And the stronger Islam got, and the more renowned the Prophet, peace be upon him, got, the easier it became to be Muslim. So the earliest ones were revered more than the others. So it's usually those who became Muslim before Hijrah, before migration to Medina, and then those who became Muslim after migration. There's that category. And then those who were Muslim before Battle of Badr, those who became Muslim after Battle of Badr. And then it goes on, and those who become Muslim after the conquest of Mecca, amongst the Sahaba, are the ones who are categorized as the least of the hierarchy. But of course, there must be, difference of quality amongst them as well. So those who took part in Battle of Badr, because that was an existential battle. If the Muslims lost it, it was the end of Islam, most likely. And there was 313 companions who took part in that, and we know their names, all of them. It's actually one. It is good to recite their name. It is Muslims have been recommended by some scholars to know their names, recite them, and for certain things. So Hasan al-Basri came to a world like this, and when his father, or after the Battle of Siffin, when Ali is now the Caliph, things are there's a political turmoils. His father and the family, whole family, moves to Basra, and thereafter he remains in Basra. And he is also known in that early years, when he is young, to take part in the army from the Basra region towards the Iran interiors, mainly in the caliphate of Ali radiallahu anh. So he was a staunch supporter of Ali, in a sense, not in a sectarian way, not in a extreme way, but in terms of preference, would you prefer Umayyads over Ali and his descendants? He would prefer Ali and his descendants from a political aspect. Now, we're going to talk about Hasan al-Basri, his sayings. He's got some wonderful sayings. Because he's the founder of, or a lot of the spiritual movements or mystical movements see him as the forefather, the main figure after Prophet Muhammad, obviously, and the companions. He's the one who starts up these certain concepts to be introduced or highlighted more. I will come to those later, what he said. So his words are preserved for that reason. But just as I did in previous 2 weeks, just want to give you a context in which he lived. I touched on some of the political developments. So it was an important time when the transition from the rightly guided caliph to Umayyad rule was taking place. Now the four rightly guided caliphs, Abu Bakr, Omar, Osman, and Ali, were all companions of the Prophet, peace be upon him. And they became Muslim very early, one of the first Muslims. And their succession was not based on hereditary, relationship, but they were seen as the best amongst all the Muslims. So there was a sense of popular election or popular support of the caliphate or the leadership. And they also tried to rule like the Prophet, peace be upon him. With law, with ethics, not for personal gain, glory, or richness. And for that reason, they're remembered by Muslims as the rightly guided caliphs. Whereas the Umayyads, I wouldn't say they were not rightly guided in a sense, but they were like any of the rulers today, you find. Probably some of them better than others, of course. They were, especially Omar bin Abdul Aziz. Omar bin Abdul Aziz is known as the fifth rightly guided caliph because he was exactly like the others. So there was this important transition, and also between 705 and 714, because of his outspokenness against the Umayyad rulers, or critique, we should say, his critique. And Basra at that time, the governor was Hajjaj bin Zalim. He had this nickname of Zalim, which means a oppressor or persecutor. He was quite ruthless. A lot of scholars died under his, unfortunately, and even some Sahaba were flogged by him. And he went into hiding in that time when Hajjaj was the governor of Iraq region, but he came out afterwards. If you're a major scholar and everyone comes to you for advice, you're going to get in trouble when certain politics go wrong way. But he was a very close friend of Omar bin Abdul Aziz, who is also Umayyad. So it's not about being against Umayyads totally. It's about their policies, perhaps the wrong policies, and not following Islamic law in a strict sense. So he became the chief judge of Basra in 720, the same year that Omar bin Abdul Aziz died, and remained in that job for a few years, but he never took salary. This is another thing about these early great figures, as I mentioned last week, that they thought that it was actually blasphemous almost to take money for doing religious duties. Because the Prophet, peace be upon him, never took salary. The companions never took salary. In fact, the Prophet, peace be upon him's time, there was no what we call public servants, people working for salary to do public duties. Everything was amazingly voluntary. And that's to me, that's quite extraordinary in that sense. So there was what really glued people together and made them create a safe society was that the collective identity that Islam has produced and their faith and also the commitment to ethics of Islam. And when people gather around these ideals and generally follow them, you need minimal policing and sort of those things. Of course, there were laws, there were courts, people committed some wrong things and even crimes, but they were minimal compared to some of the things that happened in our time. So that was the first one. There was that political shift, and the main one was the Kharijites. I touched on the Kharijites. The word Khariji means outsiders. The Ummah, the mainstream Muslim majority, called them that they fell outside of the ambit of Islam because of the extreme doctrines and violence, more importantly violence. Because they said that if anyone committed major sin, they get out of religion, and if they get out of religion, they become murtad, it's called, and then they could be killed. This is exactly what some people today justify killing of Muslims in our time, unfortunately. It's a big problem. I got a phone call today. I was at a funeral service, somebody passed away, and I got a call from someone who was asking me about this question. So the general Muslim scholarship saw this idea or theology is not Islamic, not sanctioned Islamically, and that if someone was to commit a major sin, they did not get out of religion. And the second, the overtone of the political discussion they coalesce into a theological discussion over predestination, qadr. I mean, the way the Umayyad rulers, when they were criticized, they were also, not only they were criticized for their practices, but they said, well, what makes you rule over us? And the Shiite Muslims, there was no Shiite and Sunni differentiation at that time. It's very important. I mean, sometimes the reference later goes back to what happened to these times, but people did not call, you Sunni, you Shiite. These things come later. Montgomery Watt calls the Sunni the majority as the general mainstream current of Islam. But the Shiites were kind of the followers of the family of the Prophet and Ali as a political choice. If you were left with the political choice of would you rather Hussein to be your Imam, your Caliph, or Yazid, who would you prefer? I think most Muslims put their hand up as Hussein. Well, that doesn't make you a Shiite in that sense. So people had preferences for political leadership, and one of the main political faction, which later becomes Shiite, said that the legitimacy of leadership is based on the leader's ability to represent not only political unity of Muslims, but also the ideals of Islam itself. So it's both religious leadership and political leadership. And only the descendants of the Prophet, peace be upon him, can do that. It's impossible for everyone else to do it, in a sense. So the Caliph must be from the descendants of the Prophet, peace be upon him. But then how does the Umayyads respond to that? And their response was, well, we are the caliphs at the moment. Doesn't Quran say that Adam alayhi salam, the first human being, was created as a caliph on earth and instituted by God? Since we are called the caliph, it means that it came to pass, a decree from God for us to be the caliphs. So basically, our legitimacy comes from God's decree, God's qadr on that sense. So it was a comeback like that. And these things started up a debate about predestination. And eventually, to settle the matter, Caliph Abdul Malik asked Hasan al-Basri to write a determination on this issue. And he wrote an epistle of Diwan, a free will. We still have it today. It's one of the earliest theological works. And a lot of scholars say that they sort of confirm its authenticity. And they said that this was the earliest books written ever that survived to us. Now, originally, written works the only book that existed as a book was Quran at that time. Hadith books were sometimes, or narrations of hadith were collected as some books, but only for private collectors. The scholar, who was a hadith scholar, collected it for his own use. It wasn't published. The first publication was Imam Malik's Muwatta. Some people actually claim that he did a bid'ah, innovation in religion, by publishing a book. I mean, last week, we talked about how knowledge is important in Islam. Yes, it is, but it always takes a courage to do something for the first time. And then when it was done, it was okay. Then the flood of books came after that. But again, don't want to give you the impression that no book were ever written. People wrote it, but it wasn't published. It was narrated mostly, verbally. But this epistle of Hasan al-Basri is one of the earliest surviving works. And in there, he argues that free will exists, but we are ultimately responsible for free will, and it is God who creates it. Like, for example, when these early Qadarites or Jabriites who believed that we were just forced to do everything was determined by God, created by God, we were just going through the motions, they gave the Quranic evidence of the verse 13:27, God leads astray whomever he wills, to give the point that it's all totally up to God. But Hasan al-Basri in this epistle, he replied, yeah, but Quran also says God leads only wrongdoers astray. So it comes as a condition, it qualifies that further. So it's not just an automatic, I will lead you astray, you stay as a good, righteous person. No, it's our wrongdoings that become the cause of God leading astray, in a sense. The creative aspect belongs to God, but the causal aspect belongs to us. So that was it became the mainstream position anyway. It really shows that the theological positions were crystallized very early in the Islamic history. And also at that time, there was some criticism of the companions. And Hasan al-Basri thought this was wrong. And just to prove the point, the superiority of the companions, like since he was considered a pious, a virtuous, knowledgeable person and revered by many, he said that I cannot be the dust in the nose of Wahshi's horse. He goes, now I have to explain what that means. Remember that early on I gave the hierarchy of the companions? Companions are those who saw Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in his lifetime and became Muslim. So they're classified as companions, and there are books that give the name of 10,000 of them. Now, amongst those, Wahshi is considered the last one. Because Wahshi killed Hamza, the uncle of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and that was the saddest moment in Prophet's life, and he was one of the last people who became Muslim as well. So Wahshi is generally considered the least of the companions. But Hasan al-Basri is saying that because Wahshi's horse, his nose of the horse, and a dust in the horse is more higher than me as a tabi'in, as a follower of the companions. So, I mean, this is an exaggeration, obviously. It's an exaggerated language. But he wanted people to put themselves to the rightful place. Like, you don't know the companions, you don't know the sacrifices they did for this religion. And they are far superior to any one of us. And this has actually become the general, at least the Sunni position towards the companions. Sunni position is that all companions are just. They're not, sin-free, but in terms of generally they are good, pious Muslims, and they are trustworthy. in transmission of religion, in that sense. So, so theologically, both Mu'tazilites and Ash'arites see Hasan al-Basri as the main scholar. It's very interesting because Mu'tazilites, Ash'ari is kind of the antagonist of the Mu'tazilites. The reason is that Hasan al-Basri represents that Sunni tradition, or the general, the theological position of the mainstream, which Ash'ari has represented later. But the Mu'tazilites see him as one of the founders because Wasil bin Atta, who was a student of Hasan al-Basri, but he leaves his circle. And that's why Hasan al-Basri is known to say, they made itizal, like they abandoned us. That's where the Mu'tazilite, the word comes from. But still, they could trace the origin to them, and it's up to them, of course. The third aspect that was important change in his time was the number of Muslims increasing dramatically, and Muslims becoming richer and richer, like well off in terms of worldly sense. But the quality of Muslims were reducing, and there was a poverty of proper religious practice, or increasing poverty, I should say. So, I mean, he wasn't the only one, but he was one of the earliest to respond to this. Response to the kind of a inconsistency between how people appear and how people who actually are. And kind of being worldly in a sense. In a way, like as a Muslim, majority of you here are Muslim, I mean, you feel that, right? In our time, there are 1.6 billion Muslims in the world. And thankfully, in terms of perhaps compared to other religions, Muslims are more observant, they show more religiosity. But if we really become critical of ourselves, do we have really quality? When measured against the standards of Islam. Not standards of today, but standards of Islam. If you were to measure yourself to standards of today, ethical, you may pass, but the Islam standards, we may fall short. So this is exactly how Hasan al-Basri and people around in that time felt. But they were comparing their time to the era of the companions. Hajjaj, for example, I mentioned Hajjaj the Zalim, the Hajjaj the ruthless, in a way. They criticized him, says, why are you so ruthless? The companions never did that, the Prophet never did that, Islam forbids this. And his answer was, if you were like the companions, I would treat you like the Prophet have treated them, or the rightly guided caliphs. You're not the companions anymore. That's not a good justification, but I mean, at least he had a comeback. I mean, it just shows that there's one thing very, very important. Sometimes we idealize certain time periods. It's kind of, we build a utopia, especially at the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, is called Asr al-Sa'adah, the era of happiness. It's kind of heaven on earth. Well, in relative terms, probably it was one of the best periods in human history. It was most likely the best periods in human history. However, it's never absolutely ideal, because we're dealing with human beings. There will always be some people who will do wrong things, who will misunderstand, and who will have selfish interests. In terms of percentage, probably it was the lowest in the era of the Prophet, peace be upon him. But it wasn't zero, these things. Because we know, like there's narrations where people commit murders, like there are cases of crimes and these are punished. That's why Islam had laws. The Quran pronounced laws. It came in response to some criminal acts. So I'm not trying to, again, even when I speak like this, for some of you, you may think, oh no, that the ideal image that was in my mind, you're destroying that. I'm not, I'm just bringing you back to reality. You can still consider that time one of the best times in human history, but it's never 100%. So in that sense, if that wasn't 100% in an ideal sense, the era of the Prophet, certainly by the time of Hasan al-Basri, it was going to be even less than that. So they perceive this as going backward. And forever, ever since then, we are trying to catch up to the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, aren't we? Probably we'll always do, but it gives us a vision, it gives you a goal and objective, and sometimes you capture that within probably a group of Muslims, sometimes in an instant or an event, but as long as you have that ideal to ascribe towards, we can do well. So Hasan al-Basri naturally considered that, and I will show you later some of the things he said, and you can see, you can get a glimpse of why he is saying those things, especially when what people identify as how they appear and the inconsistency between their beliefs and actions. He was picking up on that. Some of the scholars in his own time or later, who came later, said great things about him. For example, Muhammad ibn Sa'd wrote a book called Tabaqat. Like Tabaqat, these are literature that talk about great scholars or figures, important people lived in their time, and they give brief biographical information. He said about Hasan al-Basri that he was all-embracing in his knowledge, a real scholar of a high standard, one who excels in jurisprudence, reliable as a source meaning the hadith source, trustworthy, a sincere worshipper, overflowing with learning, outspoken, beautiful and handsome. He was also one of the bravest men, because he had the courage of going against Hajjaj. Ibn Burda said, no one is similar to the companions of the Prophet as Hasan al-Basri was. Abu Qatada said, keep close to this old man, for I have seen no one whose opinion is like that of Omar, as Al-Hasan is. Omar meaning the second caliph. Anas bin Malik said, ask Al-Hasan, for he still remembers while we forgot. And Hammam says, it is said that the earth will never be lacking in 7 men. It doesn't explain what this 7 men is. Through them people will get rain, and with their blessings they will be defended. And I hope that Al-Hasan is one of them. A man asked Atta about reciting the Quran on the funeral, but like, can you recite the Quran when a person is buried or in the grave? And his answer was that he never learned or heard this from anyone. And then the man said, Al-Hasan says that we have to recite. And Atta then said, follow this, because Al-Hasan is a great scholar. Not that in that time, still these disciplines are forming and they're developing in that sense. And we now have answers to all these questions. But it just shows that how scholars had trust in him and his opinion. And if they did not know anything and he narrated it from the companions, they accepted that. Hajjaj al-Aswad said, this is a different Hajjaj, a man once expressed the following wish. He said, I wish I were a hermit like Al-Hasan, a pious as Ibn Sirin, as a good worshipper as Ubadah ibn Abdul Qais, and as understanding jurisprudence as Sa'd ibn al-Musayyib. And those who heard this said, well, Al-Hasan al-Basri has all of them. So you just follow his example. He narrated the hadith as well, and I'll just mention a couple of them. Rabia ibn Kulthum quoted Hasan al-Basri saying, "We learned from Abu Hurairah the following: the Prophet ordered me to do three things: to take a shower on Friday, every Friday, to finish my prayers nightly with one final prostration, and to fast 3 days every month." So basically, if you don't wash yourself, at least you should wash once a week. You know, I mean, for us today, this is a very pretty not a good standard, as most often people wash every day or every second day, perhaps, or have shower. But not that water was scarce. People didn't have showers, you know, all the times. And even in some traditions, not washing was a good thing. And a lot of people went to, and every Friday, you know, you have to go to the mosque. And if you're stinking, you know, you haven't been washing yourself for 6 days, obviously it's not good. You're going to smell badly. So the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, wash yourself. This was so important, but I'll just tell you something, a bit of a side issue. But once Omar, when he was the Caliph, Othman came, I think Omar wanted to prove a point, because people were not washing themselves. And while he was delivering the sermon, he asked Othman, maybe because he could get away with him, "Have you washed yourself?" And Othman said, "No." He goes, "Go home, wash yourself." And they say that Othman came and his hair was still wet, came back. So it was a very important hadith in a sense. There's another hadith, usually this was narrated by multiple channels. It's known as mutawatir. Mutawatir is the most authentic of all narrations. So Hasan al-Basri narrated that he said, the Messenger of God, peace be upon him, used to, and this is narrated from Anas bin Malik. Now Anas bin Malik was one of the oldest or most surviving of the companions. He died at the age of 100 years. And he was a child at the time of the Prophet. He served him, so he lived for a long time. So he narrated from Anas ibn Malik. He said, the Messenger of God, peace be upon him, used to give Friday sermons while standing near a piece of wood, against which he would lean his back. When the number of people increased in the mosque, he said, "Make a pulpit 2 steps for me," which they did. When the Prophet stood up to give the sermon on Friday, he said, the piece of wood moaned as if it expressed its feeling of missing the Messenger of God. He was crying, the wood was making noise. And Anas commented, "I was in the mosque and heard the piece of moan. It continued to moan until the Prophet descended to it and embraced it, then it was silent." And other reports say that they asked the Prophet, "What did you?" He was saying something, and he said, "I said to the wood, I will be with you in paradise," you know. And then it stopped moaning. And Hasan al-Basri, every time he narrated this hadith, he would cry. He would say, "We are more worthy of crying than a piece of wood." What has happened to people that they could not even shed tears? You know, out of love of the Prophet, peace be upon him. So in a way, become worse than less sensitive than a piece of wood. And between 684 and 704, he gives sermons. Hasan al-Basri was known for his sermons. Some of those survive, and scholars say that they are one of the best pieces of Arabic language, in a sense, examples of Arabic prose. And from that we get this deeply sensitive person. Now, I know that I'm running out of time, but I'll just go and talk to you about his wise sayings, and I'll finish off with that. It's 20 past 8, isn't it? Is that right time? Quarter past, all right, I can't believe, yeah. All right, So these are the sayings of Hasan al-Basri narrated by scholars, and some of them hadith scholars. How strange it is that person whose departure has been announced and whose predecessors have already departed still plays around. It's like you're at the airport, your departure is being announced, and you're still having coffee, not rushing to your gate. So in a way, he's talking about the transience of life, that we have the certainty of death, but still people think and behave as if they will be here forever. To learn a single topic of knowledge and teach it to a Muslim is more beloved to me than having the whole world and giving it in the cause of God. So teaching a single topic of knowledge is more beloved to me. So he had a great endearment of knowledge itself. And this is really nice, I like this one. One who acts without knowledge is like one travels off the path, and the one who acts without knowledge corrupts more than he rectifies. So the one acts without knowledge corrupts more than he rectifies. Does that sound familiar? You know. So seek knowledge in a way that does not harm your worship, and seek to worship in a way that does not harm knowledge. For verily there are people who sought to worship by abandoned knowledge until they attacked the ummah of the Prophet. He's talking about Kharijites. They abandoned knowledge, but they were very good worshippers. And they were trying to fix things, but they created more problems and they corrupted more. Now, you know, sometimes when, this is not him saying, this is sort of me qualifying that. When I'm not trying to be put people as Muslims and non-Muslims, but I know that Muslims generally do. When a non-Muslim does something damaging Islam or damaging to Muslims, they only damage Muslims themselves. But when a Muslim does something wrong, in the name of religion, it damages Islam itself, not just Muslims. Because you're acting in the name of religion. When a non-Muslim does anything, he or she is not acting in the name of Islam. So whatever wrong that may do will never be attributed to Islam. I think this is what Hasan al-Basri was pointing to. And I also like this one as well. There are many sayings, I just selected some of them that resonated with me. The intelligent person's tongue is behind his heart. So intelligent person's tongue is behind his heart. When he wants to speak, he thinks first. This is what he means by being behind his heart. If his words will be in his favor, he says them, and if they will be against him, he does not speak. And the ignorant person's heart is behind his tongue. So when he merely thinks of saying something, he says it without thinking about it. So that's very important, good lesson there. People say that the one who has been on Hajj is the one who is forgiven. And the sign of this is that he leaves the evil he used to do. So he's always linking religiosity, which is an outward display of religious practices or rituals of Islam, to the heart and to the ethical behavior of Muslims. This was, once again, there's repeated sayings of that line. And finally, life of this world is made up of 3 days. Your life is just 3 days. Yesterday was gone with all that was done. Tomorrow you may never reach, no guarantees. But today is for you to do what you should do today, all there is. So basically, your time that you have, your life is really now. And we have this sensation and appreciation of time and a memory of the past and an imagination about the future. What could future be like? But past is really gone, and future, you have no guarantees. So our lives is a collection of moments of now, right? A series of nows. As I speak now, what I said 10 seconds ago became past. But thankfully that we have a memory and an appreciation of time, we have this sense of continuity. But really, what's gone is gone. Just look at your photos 10 years ago. So when death approached Hasan al-Basri, he began to say, we are for God, inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. We are from God and to Him we will return. And he repeated that a lot. When Hassan ibn Hisham said that we were with Muhammad ibn Sirin, who was a major scholar himself, on Thursday evening, when a man told him about the death of Hasan al-Basri, he was so sad that he kept silent and the color of his face changed. He also died about 100 days later from that sadness. That's how much he was valued. And they say that when the whole city of Basra attended his funeral service, to an extent that except the mosque that he was in, all the mosques, they missed prayer. They did not perform the Asr prayer because there was no one around. So there was no congregation in those mosques. So everyone attended his... and this is a great example, like we should all die like this, when the whole city comes to our funeral, imagine that. That also shows his fame and how much he was loved and respected. And I think this is a great example of people who are respected in their lifetime. And you usually see a reflection of that in their funeral, when, all that political aspects or being worried about how they will appear. But when someone dies, people relax and they can show their true emotions about the person. So may Allah enable us to live a life like Hasan al-Basri. And as I said at the beginning, he was a polymath from a religious sense. He was knowledgeable in all sciences, and he was like a stem cell figure. As I said, so I use that metaphor to say that in him you can find the seed of all Islamic disciplines, and they all kind of refer back to Hasan al-Basri. He's one of the few scholars who is referenced all the time. We should have really started with Hasan al-Basri in the first week, but so be it. We'll come back all around the circle. And I'll stop there, and maybe if you have any questions, I can respond to it. If not, we'll give a break. I'm taking questions now because I'm going to leave for Canberra. I've got a 2-day training course in Canberra, so hopefully leaving straight away.
Thank you so much for the lecture. I just wanted to find out, you mentioned the book. Where is it possible to find a copy of that?
Epistle of Hasan al-Basri. Search internet. It's a short treatise. Mm-hmm. It's not really a big size. But he outlines the explanations and the theology, his views on Qadar.
So it's available on
So
internet.
it's available in books. So you just have to search that.
I don't know how this is going to come out. You mentioned something about Muslims killing other Muslims, okay, because I want to make it relevant to today. So in the time of Hasan al-Basri, he was talking about that in regards to the predestination, what you were talking about. Do you remember?
No, it was about Kharijites.
Kharijites,
Kharijites were in the dispute of the caliphate, the political dispute between Muawiyah and Ali. Muawiyah was the governor of Syria, and Ali just after the assassination of the third caliph by some rebels from Egypt, Ali became the fourth caliph. So finding and punishing those who were guilty for the assassination was a big issue. And Ali wanted to get calm and so on before he could do that. He changed all the governors, but Muawiyah refused to step down, and that caused a dispute of caliphate, which resulted in a battle. Now, a portion of people in the army of Ali, and that battle stopped inconclusively, and people called for arbitration between them, not fighting. A group amongst the Ali side, who were known to be very pious people, but Kharijites are like a Bedouin, uneducated, literalist people, so absolutists, like puritanical. They thought that this was a wrong thing to do and deserted Ali's army, or they deserted both sides, so they became Kharijites. And they developed this idea that because they were so religious, pious themselves, anyone who were to commit grave sin became non-Muslim. So they could not reconcile belief in God and sinning in a major way. So they said that they concluded that then that's a proof that they're not Muslim, they're not believers. Now, this apostasy issue is a very controversial issue. I really believe, and some scholars also believe, that the rulings on apostasy should be reviewed in our time. Because when you really examine it, in the time of the Prophet, there were only a few cases, and Quran never says there's no punishment for apostasy in the Quran. References really goes back to a few cases in the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him. Now, in both of those, like in those cases, a person who left Islam went to Mecca to fight Muslims. So it was really an act of treason. So what was being punished as capital death, capital punishment, was the act of treason, which many countries even today would, either life imprisonment or capital punishment. But later jurists have focused on the leaving Islam part, and that was shown as the main cause for the capital punishment. But it goes against the, La ikraha fid din. The Quran itself says there's no compulsion in religion. And some scholars also said later, well, if a person leaves religion but doesn't preach religion, then it's okay. But if they become active, then this applies. They try to qualify that. So what happens today is that, still it exists in the classic Islamic law that punishment for apostasy is capital punishment. Now, what ISIS or groups like ISIS do is that when you look at the literature, they use the word murtad all the time. Murtad means an apostate. And all the justification of killing Muslims in Syria or Iraq is built on this idea that they first declare someone as apostate, and then their shedding their blood becomes lawful. Or they remove the barrier, legal and psychological barrier of killing Muslims, which, there are so many narrations from the Prophet, peace be upon him, that would, you'd have to be crazy to commit both takfir, or declaring someone, excommunicate someone, and killing them. Like the Prophet, peace be upon him, for example, one day in front of Kaaba, he said, Kaaba is the most sacred place, but the life and blood of a Muslim is more dear than this. There's so many. Just read, there's a fatwa against suicide bombing and terrorism, this was written before ISIS emerged by the Pakistani scholar Sheikh Tahir al-Qadri, 450 pages. It quotes Quran, the Prophet, peace be upon him, the all famous scholars. When you read that, there's no room in Islam for this kind of acts. But that aspect of apostasy and capital punishment is there. It needs to be addressed. Inshallah, towards the end of this year, in October, we're going to have a conference which the title of the conference is Rebuttal of Theological Underpinnings of Radicalism. And all these issues will be taken up, hopefully, by some people. And we intend to produce a